National parks, are they in danger of disappearing? And what would happen if they did? Today, we're with Dr. Sara Fingal from American Studies, and she's going to help us make it make sense. Let's start with the basics. What exactly are national parks and what makes them different than other public lands?
So national parks are public lands that the federal government owns and manages. And these places there's 63 national parks, and you may have heard of Yosemite, the Grand Canyon, Yellowstone, but there's also over 400 other places that the National Park Service owns and manages throughout the United States that include historical monuments or other locations. And these are landscapes that the federal government has chosen to preserve or actually manage because of their beautiful locations or their scenic beauty or their historical significance or cultural significance. Prior to the current administration, the National Park Service and other government entities actually call them America's crown jewels, and they've been commonly referred to as America's best idea by Ken Burns and others. And this indicates their cultural significance for many Americans, but also people all over the world come to visit America's national parks.
How did national parks come to be, and are they connected to other U.S. historical moments?
So Yosemite, for example, it was Abraham Lincoln that made it so that Yosemite was a park, but it was part of California and it was under California's control initially. The first national park was actually in Yellowstone and was founded in 1872. And these places were founded for a few different reasons that maybe people don't know about. One was for conservation of natural resources, because there were worries about the decline of forests and that lumber or those sorts of things would be lost resources. But then there were people like the first Sierra Club president, John Muir, who saw these places as sacred and as a place to come and connect with kind of a spiritual nature. Ultimately, they also were places for people to go recreate, and particularly the middle class. And so they were tourist locations kind of from the beginning. And unfortunately, this was to the detriment of Native American communities who were forced out of these places. And I don't know if you want to get to that later. But
That fascinates me too. I would love to get into that later.
There's this really complicated and conflicted history that the current National Park Service has done some attempts to kind of work with Native American communities and try to work out different solutions or find ways to preserve sacred places. But a lot of that could potentially be lost.
Yeah, because we've been talking about land acknowledgements, right? And what are the places that would be actually easier to give back to Native American groups for preservation? And I was motivated. My husband is Canadian, so we took a trip up in northern BC the BC government had given over control to the Nisga'a Nation of a national park to manage, and I think that's we're starting to do that.
And that is a question that's been brought up is should there be a partnership? Should there be the turning over of national parks to Native American management? But I don't know if those discussions have been halted, especially with the decline in staff and also the kind of continued erasure of this history and of Native American cultural sites and how significant they are for Native American history and for current Native American communities.
So flash forward to today, who is using national parks and what's drawing people to them?
In 2024, there were over 330 million visits to national parks.
Wow.
This was a record-breaking number. This was more than they had ever had in their history. This also speaks to how critical these places are for American identity and what kinds of how special these places are for so many Americans, but also people from all over the world. That being said, traditionally these visits have been shaped by mobility, by class, by race, and by most of these these parks are remote, require a car to get there, and they're not really equally available to everyone. And again, the National Park Service and other park services have tried to address this in recent years and trying to figure out ways in order to increase access to them. Whether or not they've been successful, by the amount of visits, maybe they have been. And the increased visibility on social media, I think, has also played a role in increasing who feels like they belong there and who feels like they can access that place. And the National Park Service has been actively working to make it so that people feel like they belong there. And so that's been one of the things that they've worked towards up until now.
Yeah. I'm an early Americanist, so I studied the 17th century, 18th century. And during that period of time, nature was seen as something to conquer and civilize, like a place of the devil. But you're describing nature as having a different role in American society. Can you describe the shift and what role it plays now?
Yes. So in the late 1800s, the late 19th century, there's this shift in understanding of nature and wilderness. And this idea of it being a scary place or a place you didn't want to go changes from it being then a place where people wanted to go for, like I mentioned, tourism, or to prove their masculinity at times, or also as a reprieve from modern society. This was, again, John Muir was one of the biggest proponents of that as a sacred place, where people could go and recharge really from the urban landscapes that they were coming from. Then you get into the 20th century, and particularly after World War II, these places become a place for families and for camping and for family trips. And that's why many baby boomers will have very fond memories of their experiences in these parks. And then subsequent generations have had traditions of going camping, particularly car camping or other types of camping in these parks and visiting them. So with the increase in leisure time after World War II, this just makes it so that the parks go from being a place that a lot of people want to visit to being really an integral, almost key component of a middle-class American life, and a suburban lifestyle, really. So it becomes, these places become locations for nostalgia and kind of part of being American is visiting a national park. Not that it's open to everyone, and not that doesn't mean that everyone has that equal access or has that kind of cultural idea of what those parks mean. But for many people, it becomes kind of this rite of passage to go and visit a national park and then bring their children and their grandchildren and subsequent generations.
Are there groups that have been excluded from these spaces, and is that changing?
National parks have a very complex history. It's hard to tell the story of all national parks because there are so many of them, and they are all different regions. But for example, in Yosemite, where the Awanichi were, that's their homelands, they were initially pushed out in order for tourists to have more access to the place, and but then they were also then brought back in to work in tourism and work as part of tourist attractions. This eventually went by the wayside, but they were forced to give up their own traditional dress and dress up as the stereotype of what tourists were thinking Native Americans look like or were supposed to be like. And so this just indicated that these places were really initially thought of as tourist landscapes. That has shifted and changed. And now there's been a push to acknowledge this complex history and try to work with Native American groups in some places. And again, it varies from park to park. And that's the concern, is that work will be lost. The other groups that have been historically excluded have been African Americans and Latinx people who haven't felt welcomed in these places. And again, there's been kind of initiatives and other things that have worked to try to include more people from all kinds of different backgrounds. And again, the worry is that all of those initiatives will be lost because of the loss of funding, the loss of support, and the erasure of this history and of these initiatives.
Let's talk about the future. If federal support for national parks dwindles, disappears entirely, what are the impacts we might see?
So even before this administration, there have been strains and cuts to national park budgets. And over again, what people have said is that they are under threat of being loved to death. And now that we have so many more millions of visitors, we really have this problem. National parks are not just empty wildernesses. They never have been. From the time when Native American communities were there to today, when the amount of infrastructure that is required for this many millions of visitors is immense. Yep. It is roads, it is vendors, it's all of the things that you can think of, but also to take care of the people once they're there who may need medical support, may need other types of supports, but are also there for educational purposes or any of those things. All of that is now under threat as it never has been before. And the thing that I worry about is that these places were already at risk of crumbling under the weight of their popularity. And now with dwindling resources, not only will we lose the history of these places, that we will lose the acknowledgments of this longer, more complicated and important cultural history. We will lose diversity initiatives to open these places to everyone and make everyone feel welcome in these places. But we also could just have them become polluted or strained to the point in which people feel like they've lost a really valuable, wonderful resource and something that Americans for a very long time have felt proud of.
Are there any wider risks that you can foresee?
With climate change that is already affecting these national parks, the loss of people who are working to manage and work on things like wildfire management, flooding, all of those things will not only just affect these national parks, but the communities who live around them and depend on these national parks. Their economies often depend on these national parks, or they've lived in these areas for generations as well. So that is a real risk, not only to these places, but also to surrounding communities. These places are not self-sustaining. They cannot take care of themselves. They were not founded in a way that they can take care of themselves, and they are not self-sustaining. My hope is that national parks are incredibly popular with people from all different backgrounds and across the aisle. Most Americans approve of the National Park Service. Actually, 75% of Americans approve of the National Park Service, making them the most popular federal agency. We just have to back that up with funding and support and with sustenance, with that kind of support, because if we don't, we're not only going to lose really valuable, wonderful places where we can have these engaging conversations about their complicated histories and about access, but we also have the loss of ecosystems that are incredibly important for our entire ecology in North America.
Yeah. You know, this trip I took up through BC, there's all the point you're making about the infrastructure needed. There was so much beautiful nature around, but it made me realize how access to that nature, there were no trails. Like there was, so it made me realize how much work is needed to make nature accessible.
It's trail management. It is road management. I mean, that is what made these places accessible. The tunnel view that you maybe have seen on Instagram or you've experienced yourself at Yosemite National Park, that is totally and completely constructed, right? Someone had to build the tunnel for the road to go through to create that awe-inspiring view that maybe brings tears to your eyes, or that you think is, oh my goodness, Yosemite Valley is so awe-inspiring. Otherwise, you would have to take a trail or, back in the day, mules or, that kind of thing to get to that place. But we just have taken for granted that we think because these are quote unquote natural landscapes that they haven't had to require, and that they don't continue to require our maintenance. And that, our connection to them is on the backs of people who have maintained and managed, and sometimes to other people's detriment, and sometimes to the ecology's detriment.
Yeah.
Really, that has had to change over generations of science and all those things to better understand ecology. Initially, it was not good. They didn't know what they were doing.
Yeah.
And so, all of that is there, and it's really become so invisible to so many people. And unfortunately, my fear is that it's going to become really visible if the roads become impassable and become where there's so many people that, that are pulling over because there's a bison herd that they can't, people can't pass by, or worse, people could get hurt, or the bison and other, we also have to think about the wildlife that's there. This amount of people visiting without any sort of management of those crowds of people could lead to the detriment of these animals as well, and of the ecosystems that they depend on. So it's very precarious, and my hope is that people will see how bad it can get. But unfortunately, it does seem like it has to get bad before people are going to do anything about it, sadly.
Because I think there is this illusion that nature, why do we need humans to make this natural place?
Right.
But as you've pointed out so well, it in many ways is a manufactured space.
Most definitely. And doesn't mean that it's not beautiful. It doesn't mean that we don't have precious memories there, maybe with our friends or family, or things that we really treasure. It just means that we have to acknowledge that these are places where they are constructed to have humans interact with them. But if it gets overwhelming, it can't handle it. And that's to the detriment of both those places. And again, like I said, the animals and the ecology and everything else, but also to the people visiting. If someone gets hurt and they can't have anyone there to help them, or any of those other things, it really could be a really disastrous situation. For example, air pollution in Yosemite Valley. It damages the trees. It makes it unpleasant for the people visiting there. I mean, because of the amount of cars. Well, the solution really is creating a public transportation system that is effective for people. Well, if you're cutting, that solution cannot happen. And so they've been under threat for a really long time, because I think that people just assume, like, oh, well.
What would you say to somebody who said, of course it makes sense to cut federal national parks, right? Like, this is nature. Why do we really need humans to be, orchestrating nature? Just let it grow.
Yeah. So, I want to start with saying that these landscapes and these places have been managed for thousands of years by Native Americans, and they just don't happen. And then you have this tourist infrastructure that developed in the late 1800s through the 1950s and post World War II, to handle the amount of people that wanted to visit these places. So we have roads, we have campsites, we have trails. All of those things have to be managed. And these millions and millions, again, over 330 million visits. That's just visitors. That's not visits. That's not the number of visitors. Someone has to handle all of that. And if any of you have ever been to Disneyland on a crowded day, you know that it takes an immense amount of staff, infrastructure, and control in order to help facilitate that kind of mass of people. Now, I'm not saying that national parks are Disneyland. I think that sometimes people think the other way of, well, then, they're just places where you can go and do whatever you want. But if you can imagine overlaying Disneyland onto a place that has a precious and ecology that needs stewardship to this day, particularly with climate change, particularly with all of the different risks towards it, and then surrounded by communities that are dependent on the economy that is facilitated by these places, then you realize how complicated and how important this infrastructure is in order for us to maintain these places that are not only important ecologically, but also culturally.